Okie dokes. So hopefully issue's fixed now. Julian Castro is going to join me in just a moment and talk about the 2020 election, the future of his campaign, and I'm so excited to have him. Should be super fun. And we're just going to kind of have a chat with some of the questions that you guys sent in, that you guys wanted to hear, and you guys wanted to ask him. So I'll actually be quoting a couple of you guys who sent in questions on Twitter and Instagram. I'm so excited. I am really so excited. There are a lot of people get starstruck when they meet, people on Disney Channel like I was for a really long time. I get really starstruck when I meet politicians, so this is going to be a super exciting moment for me. Awesome. Sending him the request now. Okay, waiting. Here we go. Hi.
Hey, Josh, how are you?
I am doing great. Welcome. Thank you for joining me.
I'm glad to join you. I'm glad that we could, I think it was on my end. Sorry for the technical difficulties. You can tell,
you're all good. You're all good. I'm glad that you're here, and I'm glad that we're talking. Last night, I asked my followers on Twitter and Instagram what kind of questions they'd like to see me ask you. But, since the whole goal of this was to have my followers get to know you as best that they can, I wanted to just kind of ask you to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about you, and on Monday, you made a pretty big announcement. Do you want to tell everyone what that was?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks again. And hello to everybody out there that's watching. So I'm Julian Castro, candidate for president. I grew up in San Antonio. I'm here right now in Texas, where the weather is pretty nice and warm. But I grew up with my mother and my grandmother here on the west side of San Antonio, and my twin brother, who some folks may have seen out there. He says that the way to tell us apart is that I'm 1 minute uglier than he is. These days, it's easy to tell us apart, though, because he has a beard and I don't. And, my brother and I went to the public schools here in San Antonio. We went out to college and law school at Stanford and Harvard. We went together because I can't get rid of my brother. And then we both had the chance to become professionals as lawyers, the first in our family to be professionals. And then both of us went into public service. So he served in the state legislature and served in Congress. And I served as mayor of San Antonio. And then I was Barack Obama's housing secretary. And now I'm running for president. I started off in January, and we were starting this campaign from scratch. And little by little, we've gotten stronger and stronger and more support out there. On Monday, I made an announcement that as we head toward the fall, that we need to raise $800,000 by the end of the month to make a push to get into the next debates and stay viable beyond November. We also released some great policy this week that looks at how we can make sure that every single family is able to prosper, and how we can reform our criminal justice system so that no matter who you are in our country, you're innocent until proven guilty, and that we do things like ensure that police treat everybody the same, and that less of our young people get caught up in a criminal justice system that kind of puts this big X on their record and makes it harder for them to get housing after they're out. So, we're out there talking about the things that matter to people all over this country and picking up some good support.
That's great. That's awesome to hear. Katie.Kazerniak on Instagram asked you, what can you offer to the country that some of the other candidates can't, and why? And then if that's a specific policy plan on an issue, how will you combat that issue, and why is it the most important thing to you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So just a couple things. First, I'm one of the very few candidates in this race, and we have a lot of candidates, right? We got 17 people that are still in the race, a lot of talented people. It's the most people that we've ever seen in a Democratic primary. But I'm one of the few ones with executive experience, right? A track record of actually being in charge and getting things done. I was Barack Obama's housing secretary, managed a department that had 8,000 employees, a $48 billion budget. I was also mayor of the 7th largest city in the United States, which is San Antonio. On top of that, I think what's distinguished our campaign over the last 10 months has been that we've been speaking up for the most vulnerable people in our country and lifting up their voices in an unabashed way, very boldly and fearlessly. Like, I'll give you a great example of that. I'm the only candidate that has released a plan on how we would reform our foster care system, because we have so many people who end up in foster care. And even though they're loving foster parents out there, too many foster kids, they end up dropping out, or they end up incarcerated or homeless. And so I proposed a whole plan on how we can make sure that less people have to go into foster care in the first place, and that if they do, that we provide resources to those foster parents, and so there's a loving home and with better outcomes for young people who go through it. So whether it's lifting up the voices of people in foster care, or folks who are homeless and sleeping on the streets of America, or victims of police violence, I haven't been afraid to tackle the thorniest issues for the most vulnerable people.
That's definitely something that I'm sure a lot of people will feel very excited about. I think one of the other issues that young people focus on a lot is the climate crisis. So we had this huge climate strike that I was a part of, and it was super exciting, on September 20th, and there's probably going to be another one coming up, and kids are striking every Friday with Fridays for Future. One of the people from the climate strike, Feliquan Charlemagne, asked me to ask you, we have to cut about half of our emissions by 2030 in order to stop the worst of the climate crisis. It goes without saying that without the US, which makes up 15% of global emissions, we won't reach that goal, and our futures, my generation, but also yours and my kids and my grandkids, will all be basically doomed. Your plan sets the goal for the US to reach net zero emissions at 2045. But assuming that you're in office for 2 terms, you wouldn't even be in office for 17 of those years, and another president could undo a lot of that progress. With those kind of thoughts in mind, why not make your plan more bold and set your targets to net zero emissions by 2030?
Yeah, thanks a lot for the question. Well, I agree with those who say that this is an emergency, and this has to be our top priority. And so I've said that my very first executive order, if I'm elected president on January 20, 2021, will be to recommit to the Paris Climate Accord, so that we lead again on sustainability, and then to do the harder work, which is to invest in a Green New Deal that will both get us to net zero and also create a whole bunch of new jobs in a clean energy economy. When I was mayor of San Antonio, I worked toward moving our local public utility toward solar energy and other renewables, and I continue to do that as president. But let me answer your question, the question directly. So we set out a plan to get to net zero by 2045, which was based on Jay Inslee's plan, Governor Inslee's plan, who was a fantastic advocate for combating the climate crisis. And some have asked, well, why didn't you try and move it sooner? We did set interim targets with a clean energy standard and a clean transportation standard. So we want to get to, for instance, a clean, renewable, zero emissions in the electricity sector by 2035, and we want to get to zero emissions light duty and medium duty automobiles by 2030. Overall, we think we can accomplish it by 2045, but I guess the bottom line answer is I also want it to be like very realistic, in terms of the investments that we can make and the timeline with folks. And I believe that that is both a realistic timeline that is bold, but that we can get done. And so I'm confident that, yes, it's true that administrations do change, but that if we set those investments in place, and if we put laws in place that point us in the right direction, and if we get the cooperation of states from across this country, then I believe that we can get there.
It's definitely bold to say net zero emissions by 2045, which is something that not all candidates have committed to, and not something that all candidates have suggested is even possible. An issue that's very important to me personally, because I just recently came out as bisexual, and my character was the first openly gay character on Disney Channel. Twitter's own @_Giroh, Giroh, asked, what will you do to help LGBTQ youth in the country who've been kicked out of their homes? You were Housing and Urban Development Secretary. and probably did some work on that. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Absolutely. As some of the folks watching this may know, in a lot of communities, up to 40% of teens who are homeless are LGBTQ. And when I was housing secretary, we worked, for instance, with the True Colors Fund that Cindy Lauper heads up to make investments so that there's more housing opportunity for LGBT youth who find themselves homeless. But we also want to work on the other end of that. We don't want them to end up homeless in the first place. And that begins with being supportive of them, of providing resources to schools that will help work with families. Because oftentimes from the people that I visited with, for instance, out in LA and in a couple of other places, you know, oftentimes it was either because they were kicked out of their homes because their parents did not accept them, or they felt so unloved and unwelcome that they, you know, went out and maybe started staying with a friend or somewhere else, but then eventually ended up homeless. And you know, we want to attack this problem from every single vantage point, from the schools, doing what we can with families. I also believe, and I've pointed this out, that we need to do things in the long run, like make sure that our textbooks, our curriculum in schools actually teaches an appreciation for the contributions of everybody and an understanding of everybody in our society, so that we raise a generation that is not only accepting of others, but is appreciative of everyone. And you know, that's not something that most policy plans or most politicians talk about, but I actually think that's the kind of long-term work that we need to do to make a real difference. In addition to, in the housing plan that I put out, I actually addressed ending youth homelessness, including in the LGBTQ community, by the end of my first term, by the end of 2024, and dedicating the resources necessary to do that.
And is that primarily through housing and urban development, where you were under President Obama?
Yeah, so I headed up HUD under President Obama. It actually takes a coordination of HUD and 18 other different federal agencies, but it's mostly HUD. And it's through things like investing in the National Housing Trust Fund, investing in what's known as permanent supportive housing, getting people into permanent housing, and then providing the supportive services that they need to get on a productive path that they want to be on in life, making sure that that housing opportunity is available. And just very quickly, I know that we can be bold and ambitious on this, because during the Obama administration, between 2010 and 2016, we actually reduced veteran homelessness by 47%. We almost cut it in half in just 6 years. And so I know if we can do that, we can also work on youth homelessness, family homelessness, chronic homelessness, and make a big difference for people.
That's fantastic. So I know a lot of the people watching this are not old enough to vote. They're not going to be able to vote in the 2020 election. I am fortunate enough to be able to vote in the primaries in Utah, which is where I live, and also in the actual final presidential election. How can you get involved even if you aren't able to vote in the primary or in the final presidential election?
Oh, there are plenty of ways to get involved. First of all, one good way is to talk to your friends and your family and your neighbors. My brother and I, we grew up in a household where my mom, she had been a civil rights activist. And so we were always dragged to like rallies, speeches, and different meetings. And so we were kind of always around it. But as part of this campaign, I've had the chance to meet a lot of young people who are not yet old enough to vote. But I have been so proud of how many young people out there are following what's happening, and they want to make a difference. Join a club at school that is involved in understanding the issues and making your voice heard. If you want to go advocate on something at the local school board meeting or city council meeting, get involved in your local community. And then for those folks who live in these states where the presidential campaigns are going to be, please go to some of these events, whichever candidate it is, because we're all crisscrossing the country. And I can guarantee you that when we go out there, when I go out there, when the other candidates go out there and we see young people at the events, we love that. We welcome that because we know that y'all have an important voice, that your voice matters. And even if you can't cast a vote right now, your parents care, your family cares what you think, other people care what you think, and we care what you think, the candidates care what you think.
So you heard it here first. If you see Secretary Castro at one of his events, you got to go up, tell him you saw this live stream, and then tell him what you think.
Yeah. Tell him Josh sent you.
Yeah, tell him I sent you.
That's
Perfect.
Right.
Awesome. And if people want to get involved with your campaign specifically, how can they do that?
They can go to either my website, it's just juliancastro.com, or same thing on Twitter or on Instagram, on Facebook, any of those platforms. But at the website, folks can actually send an email and we'll get a hold of them.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me. Thank you so much for talking. If you want to get involved with Secretary Castro's campaign, you just heard how. JulianCastro.com, at Julian Castro on Instagram, and at Julian Castro, or Julian Castro TX on Instagram, and at Julian Castro on Twitter. Awesome. Thank you so much for joining me.
Hey, thanks a lot, Josh. Thank you.
Have a good one.
Good to talk to you.
Good to see you again. Bye. Okay. Well, thank you for joining me on this live stream. It was super fun to have Secretary Castro on. Thank you again to him and his entire campaign team. We will be talking a little bit more later. As always, you can follow me on my Twitter, which is at Joshua Rush, or on my Instagram, also at Joshua Rush. Thank you so much for coming in. Bye, guys.